idag. Och först skulle jag vilja lämna ordet till Conny Reuter som representerar Solidar. Och därefter så är det kollegan Rui Tavares som har begärt ordet. Men ge mig en signal om ni önskar några inlägg i debatten eller frågor, så antecknar jag er på talarlistan. Men först vill jag välkomna Conny Reuter från Solidar. Varsågod.
Yes, thank you very much. Before I start, let me just say to the English translation, it's not a she, it's he, it's me. I'm not a woman, but this often happens for my first name, Conny, so my original name. It's no discrimination at all, but sometimes it brings you in funny situations. For example, if you go to a hospital and then they propose you to go to the women's department, because they consider you a woman, but this is another story. First of all, I would like to thank you for taking the initiative. I must say, from Solidar we were a little bit jealous because we had the same idea to invite Mr. Wilkinson to invite you to come, because we were all amazed in our organization, which is a network of 52 organizations working in the field of social policies, development policies, and also in the field of education. On the book that you wrote, because it is really food for thought. And I really appreciate, I'm not the only one, I think most of us at the applause for the show really appreciated that you put the figures together and give corpus to some new and fresh ideas. Why do we need new and fresh ideas? We have been undergoing in the last year all the debate on Europe 2020 agenda. We have been focusing on the question of poverty platform. We have been discussing very much what are the indicators for poverty. Is it the 60%? Is it jobless households or material deprivation? And we were so much focused on the question of poverty that I was always asking myself, but what is the idea behind? For sure, from the Catholic Church to the very left, we are all against poverty. We all want to fight poverty. But what we are looking for and what we are lacking, what we are missing, is the idea of another societal model. We have been assisting since 1989 to the complete disaster of a societal model that wanted everybody in equality and which has shown that there was no equality. We also have been assisting, Mr. Wilkinson, you mentioned it, towards the disastrous consequences of the neoliberal ideas from Maggie Thatcher and later on also from Reagan. But also, well, let's say, I would also say there were also some faults in thought by those who published the Blair and Schroeder paper, which was a governing model, and where this idea of equality and social cohesion of our societies was completely given up. Because the reference terms now, what are they? They are growth, they are competition, and they are individual risk. So what I learned from your book, I think it's very helpful for us because it gives food for thought for different things. Let me highlight one or two, and then let's enter the discussion with the other participants. First of all, I think putting the question of equality on the agenda, it is a word that is banned like welfare has been banned in the past, and social protection schemes have been banned in the past. They have been used in the times of crisis because everybody was happy that we still have a European social model with the so-called automatic stabilizers. But as a consequence of the financial crisis, what we are doing now, because of austerity policies, there is an attack, a massive attack on the social protection schemes. And without the social protection schemes, we cannot go for more equality in our societies. The idea of what keeps societies together is an idea that really is raised in different countries. At least I know from my member organizations in Germany and France, they work on the question, comment faire society, or what keeps the society together. And I think this is where your book comes in, where your study comes in. Because it's not with ideology. It is very much based on facts, and these facts you deliver, and the interpretation you give is really opening a new, I would say, in a positive sense, boulevard. The question, the matter of equality, and the consequences that this would mean, for example, also in the field of social work, is the question that we have to raise for ourselves. You enter and you bring in the debate at the end, in particular, and I welcome it very much. I wrote it down. You used terms that we are not so much in the progressive families and in the left families, we are not so much to use to speak about the question of trust, to speak on the question of, well, of learning, we speak, yes, but of love, and all this, the question of friendship is and in general in politics, friendship do not exist. This is what we are used to, but it's wrong. But let's say we have to learn when we integrate what you are saying here, then there's an opportunity to put also more behind to say what kind of societies do we want, not only in Europe, but also outside of Europe. Because where's the problem of unequal opportunities? I remember a debate that we had 2 years ago with President Barroso, when he presented the social agenda, and one of the items of the social agenda was opportunities. And the social NGOs, they said to Barroso and said, this cannot go, we must speak on equal opportunities. And he, for sure, this is not his idea. His idea is to say, yeah, opportunities is like in the United States, everybody can have an opportunity to just much catch it up, and then you can go up. And I think by the statistics that you were showing, it is completely the opposite. And I think this is really hard stuff and hard data and hard facts that we can use. The last point I want to make as a consequence of what you were presenting, I think we also have to look in a mirror from the work that we are doing, because we have to look and to reconsider what are really, how can we contribute to a change of paradigm. You were raising the question of growth. Everything is growth orientated. Yeah? And although we have this Europe 2020 agenda with smart, sustainable and inclusive, yeah, you have the impression that smart, sustainable and inclusive is just backlash, and what remains is only the question of growth. And the annual growth survey, there's nothing on inclusive, there's nothing on cohesive, there's nothing all of this. And I think therefore it's important that for sure that we start to work with you on this data and to look how we can use it to develop not only formulation of social policies, but really to contribute also to the change of the paradigms here in European policies and outside. And let me say last personal word. I'm a little bit, not so fresh this morning because I just came back this night from Dakar from the World Social Forum. So the move from the dust of the World Social Forum to the rooms of the European Parliament is a cultural change. It's not a shock, but it's a change. What I find the most impressive, and the World Social Forum is taking place in the University of Dakar, and you see these 10,000s of young Senegalese who go to university and who expect to still consider that by learning, by doing well, they have equal opportunities. I would not stand up and say, well, for a human being, I'm not sure that you have them. But it gives me a lot of courage and energy to say we have to continue the fight, because what was also said in the example of your personal friends. My generation, the 60s and 70s, we believed in the social elevator. It was working. Coming from poor families, you could make studies, go to university and so on. What social work has now stated is that people and children who live in the second or third generation in families without employment, who have no friends, who isolate themselves every day more. There is really the problem that can we create this new social elevator, these new pathways to bring them back into society, lifting them out of poverty and giving them a social existence. So I will not dare to comment what you have been saying, but I was invited to give a comment in the sense of food for thought, and I'm very happy and appreciate very much that you are here for the first time. Perhaps it would have been good also that you go and meet the President's Conference of the political groups of the Parliament. I think there are at last 5 or 6 who would need also food for thought from your side. Thank you.
Tack för de synpunkterna. Jag delar uppfattningen att det hade nog varit bra med deltagande inför sessionen i Strasbourg när vi nu ska diskutera EU 2020-strategin. Där man på EU-nivå enbart talar om att öka konkurrenskraften, öka tillväxten, utan att diskutera någonting om fördelningspolitik eller ekologisk hållbar utveckling. Det har varit viktigt. Då vill jag ge ordet till kollegan Rui Tavares. Varsågod.
Well, thank you, Eva-Britt and Katika, for this debate, and also thank you to Professor Wilkinson for your book. I wonder if you can speculate a little bit on the cultural angle, the cultural aspect of inequality, particularly media discourse, political discourse, these kind of things. For instance, you quoted your colleague's quip about if you want to live the American dream, maybe you should go to Denmark. And well, yes, if the American dream is to climb socially, but what about if the American dream, as seen through the mirror of movies, television, etc., is not just to go up on the social ladder, but to actually have 8 times more money than the poorest in the society. So maybe the preference of Americans would be to live in Denmark, but the American dream or the American obsession would be to earn 8 times plus rather than 3 times plus, even if you have a much smaller chance of actually earning 8 times plus. So what I'm trying to get at is that the intensity with which people feel competition is greater than the intensity with which they desire to live in a level society. For instance, I would like, if you, maybe, I don't know if you can illustrate with some examples from the reception to your book, but I've seen that there is a certain aggressiveness on part of some of the people that have discussed your book, and the kind of Tea Party, Fox News spirit, where there is even almost a denialism of what inequality does. And so the question is, why are we, the rest of us, who are not social scientists, why are we so insensitive towards inequality? The kind of aggressiveness that pushes for inequality in places like Brazil, for instance, that I know quite well, and where you have this push for competitiveness, for certain aggressiveness on the side of inequality. This is very important for us as politicians, because I think that the hardest part of our task is to unweave this web that favors inequality. Especially if you live in countries that are already unequal. I come from Portugal. People would like to live in Denmark, but it's very difficult to find the right kind of discourse that will make the country choose to follow the path of Denmark or Sweden, rather than say, for instance, we have to grow, and then we may distribute. Thank you very much.
Tack. Och då ger jag ordet till Richard Wilkinson för att kommentera. Varsågod.
Right. I'll address the last comments, I think, first. I think the desire for higher living standards, that you were talking about initially, higher absolute living standards, people have to understand that as a zero-sum game. You can improve your well-being and your health and your happiness if you move up within the given society. So, as an individual strategy, it makes sense for me to get richer in my society. But if we all get richer, that is a zero-sum game. You know, the improvements in health are no longer related to economic growth. Happiness, well-being, no longer related to economic growth. So it is no longer legitimate to add the individual desire for more income into a societal desire for economic growth. You know, if I improve my position in society, I worsen marginally all the people below me. That's why it's a zero-sum game. And I think we must... People already have that intuition about consumerism. Consumerism is driven by status competition. And people know that it's hollow. There's surveys that show that the vast majority of people recognize that there's a conflict with more important human values. When they talk typically about better to have time for friends and family and community and that kind of thing. Consumerism is something that we're driven to despite our better judgments. I may say that is one of the connections with environmental issues, that consumerism is the big threat to sustainability, the biggest threat to sustainability, and it is driven very substantially, not only by status competition, but that is intensified by inequality. So if you want to control consumerism, if you want to reduce consumerism, you must reduce inequality. It's interesting, I could have gone on to show you data that shows that people in more unequal societies work longer hours. They save less of their income, they get into debt more. All because money becomes even more important in those societies, because it shows what you're worth as a person. But we really have to move beyond those individual feelings and individual solutions to the societal strategy, where economic growth is a zero-sum game. I think in terms of political response, there is, you know how we regard the people at the top as brilliant and the people at the bottom as failures, in the prejudiced view. The bankers were brilliant and people at the bottom are stupid and lazy. There is what primatologists call the bicycling reaction. That term started with Adorno's studies of Nazi Germany, talking about how you respect those above you and you kick down on the ones below, and it's called the bicycling reaction because you're bowing to the ones above and kicking down on the ones below. And you see humans do this in all sorts of situations. I know lots of little phrases, like one of them is the captain kicks the cabin boy and the cabin boy kicks the cat. But at a more serious level, and you see animals that have lost a battle for social status, they then attack the ones below, and that can go down like a chain reaction. But where you see it most clearly is, I think, in racism. If you're deprived of your social status, you say, you try and regain it by saying, at least I'm better than those bastards. Or if you see it also in prisons, where people are humiliated and shamed, but they take it out on the sex offenders, who often have to be housed separately. At least I'm better than those people. So there are these sort of processes that are created by inequality and make people build them into inequality even more by looking up, respecting the ones above and kicking down on the ones below. And that is the side which maintains this stuff that we have to overcome. I didn't say anything about where we go from here. I should have pointed out that societies have quite different ways of getting more equal. Sweden starts off with very big differences in earnings, and it redistributes with taxes, high taxes and generous benefits. But societies like Japan have small income differences to start with, before tax, and they have lower taxes and not such a generous welfare state. And we found just the same contrast in the United States. One of the states that does better, in the top, 5 or 6, is New Hampshire. It has lower state taxation than any state except Alaska, and very little social expenditure. But its initial differences in earnings are smaller. I think one reason for that is that they protect trade union-like rights. You are not allowed to ask employees to sign a contract banning trade union membership, and it's illegal to organize strike breakers. That might be one reason why the earnings differences are smaller to start with. So it doesn't matter how you get your greater equality as long as you get there somehow. We think that taxes and benefits are a difficult battle to fight, and even if we make progress on that front, the next government along can undo it all so easily. So we think that more important is a long-term program to develop and expand the more democratic sector of our economies. The cooperatives, the employee-owned companies, the mutual societies, the friendly societies, all those kinds of companies. And we're going to have a meeting very soon in London to think about establishing an ethical consumers movement, a bit like fair trade, but to support those kinds of companies and companies with smaller differences in incomes. You know, you might vote for your boss to have twice as much as you. You might even think he should get 5 times as much as you, but you don't think he should get several hundred times as much as you. And so those more democratic companies do have smaller income differences. I think we need to be building an idea of a future that we move towards, a sustainable society, a more equal society, a society where we take the benefits of higher productivity, not in terms of consumerism and higher material living standards, but in terms of more time, more leisure, more time for each other. And I think we need to think of a transformation of work through more democratic structures. You know, it really does change the nature of a workplace if it is ultimately controlled by its employees. And they do better in terms of productivity. I was once going to do a research project comparing 10 employee-owned companies with 10 others. I didn't get the money to do it, but I visited several companies that had just been through employee buyouts. And one of the things people said is that it turns a company from being a piece of property into a community. And of course we've lost community in residential areas. People don't know their neighbours anymore. But where we're most closely involved with each other is at work. But it's at work where the social relationships are damaged by, you know, having a chain of command and superiority and inferiority most clearly stated. It's also at work that income is divided first and inequality is created. So the long-term project for progressive politics is to expand that area of our society, of our economies, that deals with a number of problems. And ethically they do better as well in terms of, you know, sustainability and environmental awards and that kind of thing.
Tack, och jag vill erinra om att ordet är fritt för kommentarer och inlägg. Och jag känner att jag själv skulle vilja komma med en kommentar med anledning av det här senaste om hierarkier, hur olika status påverkar oss. Betydelsen av att om man är högre på samhällsstegen så sparkar man neråt, och exemplet från invandrare i våra samhällen, hur vi lätt ser dem som att de har möjlighet att sparka på. Det föranledde mig att tänka på, och som jag har funderat över väldigt mycket, hur man ser på olika saker som människor gör i samhället. Ta exemplet hur fruktansvärt skamligt det är för någon som på grund av bristande ekonomi helt enkelt inte har pengar, snatta mat i en matbutik. Det är fruktansvärt skamligt och så vidare. Sen å andra sidan så lever vi med att vi väldigt ofta ser bankdirektörer, vd:ar för stora företag som genom bedrägeri eller på annat sätt tillskansar sig hundratusentals, kanske miljoner. När man då jämför de här båda brotten så hör vi ofta att man nästan med beundran i rösten talar om de här som genom ekonomisk brottslighet har tillskansat sig så oerhört mycket. Medan den andra delen är fortfarande så oerhört skambelagt och så vidare. Och där kan man ju fundera över, är det också en del av att den status som de olika människorna har från början Och att vi också runt omkring de här människorna delar den här synen på status och därför ser så olika på de olika brotten. En tanke när jag lyssnade på de här kommentarerna. Ja, ordet är fritt. Varsågoda för kommentarer. Nu har vi tillfälle att få lära oss ytterligare mer och då vill jag lämna ordet till Jöran Fagerlund från Sverige och ifrån Göteborg. Varsågod Jöran.
Thank you, Eva-Britt. Thank you for an excellent performance. I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on inequality and climate change and environment. One part in your book is really interesting, where you say that consumerism is not a sign of it's a sign that we're social and not egoistic. I would like if you could elaborate on that. And also the kind of boomerang effect you talk about with new technology. If we save energy, if we make more fuel efficient car, people tend to drive more, not use less energy. And also about carbon dioxide rations. You make a comparison to this Second World War when food was rationed. You had rations, you had a couple of portions each. And one concrete question is, if you allow people to sell their parts, their rations, for people, you could get a distribution of wealth. But if it has rations, what if poor people sell their parts? What shall they use the money they get if there is nothing more to buy? Since it's all rations. I'm not sure if
Can you repeat that last one?
Well, if you mentioned some parts that could be, you should have rations, energy, transportation, but if we do it full scale, everything has rations. We calculate the carbon footprint on everything, and one way would be that if I use less, I could sell it to somebody who wants to use more. But when I get money, what should I use the money for if I have sold all my rations? So then distribution doesn't really. Well, those were the questions about climate change and equality I would like to ask.
Yes, some difficult points. Our point about consumerism being not... consumerism is often taken as showing how materialistic and antisocial we are. But actually, in a sense, it shows how extraordinarily social we are, because consumerism is about how we appear to others. It's driven by wanting to appear better in other people's eyes. So in a sense, it's an indication of how deeply social we are. It's wrong to think it does mean. It's wrong to think it means that our primary relationship, the primary human relationship, is between people and things. It's actually part of the way in which the primary relationship is between people and people. We use the material to mediate between us. I make her think I'm better by having all sorts of nice things. So that was that point. I think at one point you were asking about... I should say that I'm not really a specialist in environmental issues, but I think you were referring to the danger that as we employ more environmentally friendly technology, you know, I drive a Prius, for instance, so you know I save petrol and so on, and we've got these light bulbs as energy saving. That all helps me save money, and I spend it and I spend it in ways that have carbon costs. And so in a sense, a society that's introduced all this labour-saving technology and used it actually to give us a higher standard of living, we've wasted some of the benefits of that environmental technology. But we really do have to hold consumption down. You were referring to suggestions that have been made about having individual carbon rations whenever you buy gas or electricity, whether your household energy consumption or your car or flights, that you lose some of your carbon ration, and maybe you should, if you're poor and you don't use it at the end of the year, you should be able to sell back the part that you saved. I don't know whether that's the best way of doing these things, but you were saying that, of course, again, there's the issue that you get money and you spend what you saved, and that incurs carbon costs. And I think maybe we should be thinking about suggestions made by, for instance, the American economist Robert Frank, that we should have consumption taxes rather than income taxes. I, again, don't feel I'm an expert on the arguments around that, but he's a very good economist and he clearly believes in them. He has a book called Luxury Fever and another more recent called Falling Behind, that are both about status, consumption and so on. I'll leave it at that.
Tack, och då vill jag ge ordet till Stellan Hermansson. Varsågod.
Jag heter Stellan Hermansson, men jag bor i Dublin och Irland. Jag jobbar med den irländska fackföreningsrörelsen sedan jag är på Irland sedan 5 år nu. Men det är så skönt för att hålla sitt modersmål, så jag tänkte utnyttja detta privilegium. Men min fråga till dig är egentligen om du skulle kunna ge råd. Jag vet att forskare inte så gärna kanske ger råd till politiker, men att ge ett råd till politiker på Irland och i Sverige. Och bakgrunden är följande då, om jag börjar med Irland. När jag flyttade till Irland för 5 år sedan så slås man som svensk av de stora klasskillnaderna i det irländska samhället. Och min fru som är lärare jobbar med kanske de barn som har det svårast i Irland, i Dublin Inner City. Många är barn i familjer där arbetslösheten har varit faktum i 3 generationer. Så social welfare är själva grunden för livet. Och det var den gruppen i irländska samhället som aldrig lyfte med den irländska keltiska tigern. Och högerpartiets Fjärran Fågel-regering brydde sig egentligen aldrig om de här människorna, även om kanske i ord sa vackra ting. Men de kom aldrig med. Och nu när den keltiska tigern är död och IMFs sparplaner så slår det allra hårdast mot de här människorna. Och det är snart val på Irland. Men även om de partier som står för jämlikhetens principer som socialdemokratiska Labour, Sinn Féin och några små vänsterpartier, de går framåt, men inte så mycket. Utan det ser istället ut som det Finn Gael, det andra högerpartiet, som kommer att bli dominerande i nästa regering med stort sett samma politik som vi har. Om man ställer sig frågan då, när man kämpar för jämlikhetsvärderingar, vad kan man göra för att vinna människors förtroende i jämlikhetsidén och att också aktivt agera och rösta för partier som står för jämlikhetsidén? Vad skulle ditt råd vara till de partier på Irland som kämpar för jämlikhetens principer? Och nästa del av frågan är från svenskt perspektiv. Det är ju svensk och tillsammans med en nordisk arbetarrörelse, men Sverige kanske var det land som lyckades allra bäst i att bygga ett samhälle, fortfarande på många fel och brister, men ändå baserat på jämlikhetens idéer. Och det visar ju din forskning väldigt tydligt också. och hur socialdemokratin, vänstern och fackföreningsrörelsen på olika sätt tillsammans bidrog till detta. Men 2006 förlorade man valet ganska tydligt till högern som sen inledde en ojämlikhetsagenda. Och trots att de gör extrema angrepp på välfärdssamhället och på jämlikhetsidén, socialförsäkringar som är brutalare nu än flera andra europeiska länder, som slår ut sjuka människor, tvingar cancersjuka som är de facto döende att söka jobb för att de har varit sjukskrivna för länge. Alltså extrema brutala idéer. Allt inbyggt i ett vackert språk om jämlikhet och arbetarrörelseord, men fakta är där hur samhället håller på att bryta sönder. Och likt förbannat, måste jag säga, så får de en väldigt tydligare majoritet i valet 2010. Vad gör socialdemokratin, vänstern och gröna för fel? Jag vet, vi för inte svensk politik väldigt nära, men det var ett generellt perspektiv. Vad beror det på för dig som forskare att människor i Irland, Sverige väljer högern, ojämlikhetens partier i en tid när det är mer behov än någonsin för vänstern och jämlikhetens ideal? Har du något råd, någon tanke?
Difficult question. I think that the left, what happened surely in, I don't know, the 1970s or 80s, is the left lost any idea of what it was really about. We lost any vision of the kind of future society we should be moving towards. People in the past didn't commit themselves to the socialist movement just because they thought a little bit on the top tax rate would be an improvement. They committed themselves to it because they were inspired by an idea of a qualitatively better society, better for us all. They believed that that's, you know, that there was empirical evidence that showed that there was another way. We know what went wrong with that. But what we've got to do is to rebuild a vision of a qualitatively better society in which we solve the environmental problems without, and at the moment, greater equality, people think that means sacrifices. We've all got to make sacrifices on behalf of the poor. But actually, you know, what the data shows is it's better for all of us to have a more equal society. Sustainability, you know, dealing with consumerism people know is hollow. To have a society where we have more leisure, instead of, as I said, instead of taking the benefits of economic growth out in terms of increased productivity, in terms of increased consumption, we want to take the benefits of increased productivity out in terms of more leisure. If we could put together a vision of a better society, round the transformation of the experience of work, employee ownership cooperatives, whatever they are, and I think we need to experiment with all those different forms of organisation. I think at the moment we're very depressed societies. You know, we don't really believe that we can solve the environmental problem because we just feel at the mercy of self-interested individuals and leading to status competition and consumerism. We have to do a long-term educational task. And when the left confines itself to just talking about poverty reduction, it is doing almost no educational work at all. And so losing the ability to inspire. Okay, I know I should be nice to the poor and give some money and that kind of thing and maybe support higher benefits. But I don't think that's going to make society better for most of us, or for me. We have to have an inspiring vision of society which is better for all of us, qualitatively better. This is an idea of a long-term transformation. But so was what people committed themselves to in the 1930s or 40s or 50s. It was a long-term transformation. I used sometimes to show a photograph of my mother when she was a baby, sitting on her grandmother's knee. Why I showed that photograph is when people talk about, you know, very long-term stuff, and, you know, mostly we try and make our politicians do something slightly different in this vote or next year or whatever. We think of the short term. All that, again, means we do none of the long-term educational work that's needed. The photograph of my mother and her grandmother. My mother died only 3 years ago. Her grandmother, on whose knee she was sitting, was born in 1826. Those two lives, two human lives, spanned from a time when there were public executions, when there was slavery, when only the rich had the vote, or only property owners had the vote in many of our countries. And, you know, largely, the world was largely agricultural. Our children are going to live to the end of the century, this century. We have got to have that long-term vision. And we've got to do the work on how we can transform our society. The inequality stuff I've been talking about is just one component of that. But actually, you know, it's about creating a better world for all of us. And sustainability, you know, the idea of more local economies, more leisure, that kind of thing, more democratic companies. I think even actually the digital, the great area of digital innovation, you know, now all human knowledge can be digitized, but pictures, music, films, computer games, computer programs, everything now can be reproduced perfectly without cost, almost without cost. That takes a whole swathe of human creativity out of the area that need be allocated by income. It suddenly becomes a public good. When I learned a little bit of economics, I was taught at London School of Economics. I remember them talking about public goods. The example they always gave was a bridge. Once society has incurred the cost of building a bridge, spent the labour and resources on building the bridge, you shouldn't charge people to walk over it, because that reduces the benefit society gets from the bridge. Access should be free. And so with the digital economy, we need to pay all the people who create it somehow, but we mustn't pay them in a way that restricts access. You know, people throughout the world could be having access to all the academic journals of the third world, all the human knowledge could be available free, all the written word, everything else. You know, the future could look quite different, and it could look excitingly different. And we have to do that, build that picture. Most people are not going to look at graphs and have an idea about the future. The easiest way of communicating it is to build a picture of the society we should be moving towards.
Tack. Ordet är fortfarande fritt. Jag har själv en kort fråga jag skulle vilja ställa, och vi har diskuterat mycket om hur just status och den här konkurrensen och bilden av den sociala statusen som vi uppfattar att vi själva har och som vi granskar andra omkring. Vi lever ju i ett samhälle där mediebilden väldigt ofta lyfter fram, enbart visar välkända, berömda, lyckade människor. Vi har dessutom idag en reklam som finns på alla offentliga utrymmen. Vi kan inte värja oss för den, vi har den överallt. Vi har den in i våra hem. Och också då en reklambild som hela tiden utmålar att lyckan är i att konsumera. Att just hur vi som personer kan förbättra vår status genom utseende och så vidare. Och jag tycker det är, i boken Jämlikhetsanden så diskuteras inte så mycket omkring just hur vi påverkas. Dessutom, inte bara av den politik som förs, utan vi påverkas också av mediebild, vi påverkas av reklamen. Som jag säger kryper in överallt i vår verklighet idag och som även går ner till barn, att de ska påverkas av den här reklamen. Och jag hävdar att reklamen skulle inte satsa dessa miljarder på reklam om den inte hade effekt. Och den har vi då också emot oss som arbetar för ett jämlikare samhälle. I och med att mycket av reklamen går ut på att visa den här konkurrensstatusen och att vi speglar oss i varandra. Jag undrar om det finns någon kommentar kring just reklamens påverkan av och hur samhällsdebatten och politiken diskuteras.
I'm sure you're right that advertising does have powerful effects and the sort of celebrity culture and what kids are reading about all the time. In a way, I think it shows the importance of the status competition that I was talking about as why inequality matters. And I'm going to make a slightly separate point as well, that I think people on, for instance, Blair in the British Labour Party, but in many other European social democratic parties, thought inequality didn't matter anymore because they had a material view of it. So, you know, they thought it mattered in the 1930s when people lived in terribly overcrowded conditions and children still didn't have shoes in some places and things like that. Then it was wrong for other people to be living in great luxury. But now most people, you know, have adequate food and clothing and central heating and cars and so on. Maybe inequality doesn't matter anymore. You see, what they were missing, that I think our book is really focuses on, is the psychosocial effects of inequality. You know, all our outcomes are, or almost all of them, are behavioural outcomes. They're to do with what people are thinking and feeling and doing, whether it's teenage pregnancies or drugs or violence, or the health is affected by stressors. So I think that advertising is almost proof of the importance of status differentiation, which the left forgot about in the 1970s or 80s or something. On advertising, I am quite sure of its power. I remember, it's not just advertising. With my children, I remember thinking, when they were watching television, the soaps, it wasn't the sex and violence that bothered me. It was the sort of hidden agenda all the time, that success is a matter of being rich, of possessions and so on, and the endless portrayal of ordinary people living in much bigger houses than they really do. So you've got that as the idea of the norm. And all I can say is that we need to control it. It's part of the overall problem, but I have nothing specific to say about how we deal with advertising. But I do think that the advertisers know very well what I'm talking about.
Is the advertising different in a more equal society?
Micro, please. And
She asked if advertising is different in a more equal society. I think we did find a paper that suggests that more is spent on advertising in more unequal societies. I can't remember where that data came from, but we reference it somewhere in the book. Can I actually just remember that people often look at our book and they think that it's all very simple. Of course we were trying to make it as simple as possible, leaving out all the technical issues. We weren't worried about that because it is dealt with in the references in the academic journals. Don't think that people haven't controlled for all sorts of other things, or haven't used more sophisticated statistical models, or haven't looked at changes over time. No, there's lots of other work. So follow up the references. But the critics will always be that our stuff is naive, we don't show causality and so on.
Varsågod Jöran.
Thank you. I would like you to ask you to continue that. When I posted on my blog, I was going here, I asked for questions, and one of the questions was, has there been any valid criticism of your works from maybe left-wing economists? Have there been any other points? We know the right-wing has criticized you a lot, but is there any, from your point of view, valid points? And you also mentioned here in the lecture that the academics, the criticism is not about the data, but about the interpretations. What other interpretations could be made or have been made by others that you see might be valid? Is there any other valid position?
Yes. The kind of criticisms that were made in the past were made principally when the only data that we were looking at that seemed to be have this pattern was health. So we were looking at why health is a little bit better in more equal societies. And of course then people thought only in terms of factors which would explain health. We didn't know initially about the violence, about the teenage births, about the drugs, anything else. So people the argument was principally about whether the causal connections were to do with direct material effects of inequality, like absolute poverty, or whether there were psychosocial effects. And I think that some people on the left in epidemiology were worried that if we started talking about psychosocial things, then governments would feel we don't really have to deal with poverty. We can just get the poor to be nice to each other. And that was a reasonable worry. My feeling was that if inequality has these psychosocial effects, that makes inequality even more important than we thought it was before. But you see, now that added into the picture are all these other social problems, all these other outcomes, they are in themselves evidence that inequality has psychosocial effects. Now, the exciting thing, I think, about this picture is that it suggests that there is a policy lever on the psychosocial well-being of whole societies. You know, you can really improve the quality of the whole social environment by reducing income differences. But the criticisms, and often amongst people who are not sort of... And one of the advantages of coming at this, working with medical people and so on through health, is that we learnt a lot about stress hormones, about the biology of stress, about monkey hierarchies and the effects of hierarchy amongst other species, that, you know, social scientists don't like looking at all that biological stuff. And so I think there were advantages in coming at it from that end. But the sort of criticisms that are made is people say it's cultural, not inequality. But you see, inequality is probably the most fundamental influence on culture. If you want to know about the behavior of any animal species, probably the first question you should ask is, do they have a ranking system? Do they have a clear social hierarchy? That will tell you about the quality of social relations. You'll find that the dominant animals are the strongest males, and that the hierarchy is by strength. That the subordinate animals don't eat unless there's food left after the more powerful ones have had their fill. That the dominant males will try and monopolize access to the females. It tells you a huge amount of about the social structure. Now, human beings have the potential to live in everything from the most tyrannical, unequal societies to the most equal, in our evolution, in our hunting and gathering prehistoric existence as anatomically modern human beings, we lived in extraordinarily egalitarian societies. Most of those societies seem to have been based on food sharing and gift exchange, with very little difference in rank and access to resources and so on. And even in our nearest neighbours, baboons, not baboons, but chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees are quite hierarchical, but bonobos are called the caring, sharing chimps. They have very little social hierarchy. The females are a bit smaller physically, but they eat first, before the males. And actually, there's a very nice pattern by which they deal with social tension through sex. Just as in human beings, it's a social bonding mechanism, not just about reproduction. And females are sexually receptive all the time, and we don't know when they're fertile and not, unlike many other animals. Bonobos are rather the same. And there's evidence that the part of the DNA which deals particularly with social relationships and bonding differs between chimps and bonobos, and we have the bonobo pattern. Sorry, that might seem a long way from these things. So the culture, I think, is created by the amount of inequality. Whether we're in this together, or whether we all have to fend for ourselves and fight for what we can get. And it even means differences in the amount of modesty. In a more equal society, I don't say, look, I'm the best, I'm this, that, and the other, and make my friends feel inferior. But in a more unequal society, you have to say, I'm really good. As my daughter talks about how a lot of people are up themselves, this sort of self-advertisement. Very different in, for instance, Japan and the USA. And I think in my lifetime in Britain, modesty is something that's gone. Modesty about your abilities and so on. The other thing that's often raised is ethnicity. Isn't it all a matter of ethnic mix? Aren't the unequal societies the ones that have had big immigration? In fact, Sweden and the US have similar proportion of the population who are foreign-born. But people have looked at ethnic mix internationally and found it doesn't explain these things, looking at ethnic mix from censuses and so on in different countries. But also the fact that these effects go all the way up the social hierarchy. It's not just the poor who suffer worse health or more violence or whatever. It's all of us. Means that it can't be just a matter of a bottom 6 or 12% who are an immigrant minority. And actually in the USA, the biggest immigrant minority are Hispanics. And despite their low education and low incomes, we have what's called the Hispanic paradox, because the health of the health of Hispanics is almost as good as non-Hispanic whites, despite their social status. It's a real paradox. But you see, things like skin color, ethnicity, language differences or religious differences only become part of this picture, and they sometimes do become part of it, insofar as they become markers of social status and, like poverty, attract stigma. So ethnicity is not a different element. It's part of the same process, a stigmatization of inferior groups. And it doesn't matter really whether it's linguistic differences or religious differences or skin color differences that carry that. So those are the kinds of criticism and controversies that might, I think, quite easily dealt with.
Tack, Stellan. Varsågod.
Först vill jag tacka för svaret på min första fråga. Det var inspirerande. För det andra så var en sak som slog mig i din genomgång, och det var att på ett flertal av de här diagrammen så kom Italien, som har stora inkomstskillnader, ändå lågt. Till exempel jag tänker på mental funktion, tonårsgraviditeter och det var några andra diagram där Italien ligger relativt lågt. Betydligt högre än Sverige än Japan, men fortfarande lägre än länder med liknande inkomstskillnader. Och den här frågan är till dig, och om det finns italienska kamrater i salen, vad kan orsaken till det vara? Och jag vet, alltså historiskt sett, nu har ju italienska vänstern mer eller mindre kollapsat, men historiskt sett fanns det ett stort kommunistparti, stark fackföreningsrörelse. De styrde vissa städer och regioner av Italien fram till nyligen, från andra världskriget. Skulle det kunna vara att de delarna av Italien så att säga lyfter statistiken? Eller finns det andra förklaringar? Och i er forskning, om du har exempel på just exempel i Italien, så är det lite centralt.
I know very little about Italy, and I think in terms of its overall performance in our index, where we put everything together, it doesn't come very far off the line. I know in mental health, its mental health is better than we would expect. I'm just trying to find some of the figures. So where they do particularly well in things like mental health, they presumably do badly in other things that offset that advantage. Can I find it? Yes, Italy. I need my glasses. I can't see Italy. Can you see Italy on that? Oh yes, it's there. It does come below the line. It does a bit better than we'd expect, even when we put everything together. One study that did look at Italy in detail, relevant to this, was of course Putnam's study, Putnam's Making Democracy Work, which was a study of the 20 regions of Italy. I believe your regional, not yours, you're Swedish, aren't you? The regional governments in Italy were set up in 1970 and with the same funding per head of population. And Robert Putnam first looked at how those different regional governments were working. Did a lot of tests of the provision of services and how quickly they dealt with issues and letters and phone calls and goodness knows what. And he then tried to explain the differences. And he found that how rich or poor the region was on average didn't explain it as well as the social capital of each area, how involved people were in community life. It was the high social capital areas that did best. Putnam was not interested in inequality, but he has a footnote in that book, Making Democracy Work, where he says there is a 0.81 correlation between his measures of social capital for those regions and inequality in those regions. And he shows the same thing in his study of American states. So again, I would say that the functioning of governments, of democracy, of community life within the Italian regions seem to be predicated on reducing on smaller inequalities. I don't know how that differs in terms of the politics, which ones were communist and which ones weren't. I've got no idea. I'll stop there.
Tack. Då ställer jag frågan igen om det är någon som har någon ytterligare kommentar innan det börjar bli dags att sammanfatta dagens seminarium. Ja, varsågod. Presentera dig själv gärna.
Jag heter Jöran Fagerlund och kommer från Sverige, Västmanland. Det är en oerhört tung bok och väldigt mycket fakta som jag tycker borde tala för sig själv. jag fascinerades av den tredje delen mycket och har funderat mycket på det du tar upp också, det här begreppet vänskap. För att om vi ska hitta en ny kvalitet i förhållandet mellan människor så är både solidaritet och andra slitna upptagna. Och jag har suttit och funderat på innehållet i vänskap. Du gick in lite på det med resonemanget om gåvor och så. Men man kan ju också se att det finns väldigt mycket gåvor i alla såna galor som skänker pengar till något land som har jordbävning eller liknande. Och för mig är det kanske inte bara vänskap utan det är något innehåll också. Hur ska man kunna utveckla begreppet vänskap? Jag är på väg.
I don't know how to define friendship. I know how it's defined in these surveys, simple questions about how many friends you have. If you needed some help in some situation, would your neighbours provide it, or all that kind of thing. Sometimes it measures the quality of the relationship between someone and their partner. Interestingly, extraordinarily detailed studies of how this affects, for instance, health. So volunteers have had little wounds made in the back of their hands, and they measure how quickly it heals. And if you have a poorer relationship with your partner, it heals more slowly. Or you give volunteers nasal drops with cold viruses in, and see how many catch colds, same measured exposure. And you give them questionnaires about how many friends they've got. And people who have fewer friends are 4 times as likely to catch colds from the same measured exposure to infection. Extraordinarily careful work where beforehand they've measured and controlled the antibodies levels people have had before this experiment. You know, a lot of this work is really very good, very sophisticated stuff, and what we're doing is just piggybacking on other people's much more careful work. But I suppose I think of public spiritedness. That's one of the reasons why I didn't mind this funny title. You know, spirit level in England is something a carpenter or bricklayer uses. It's a bubble level to find out whether something is horizontal or vertical. But spirit level also, public spiritedness. And I think that we do show some evidence that people in more equal societies are more aware of the common good. And that's one of the connections with environmental issues. That because people are more involved in community life, because there is the higher levels of trust, those societies are better at recycling. They give more in foreign aid to developing countries. And you know, environmentally, we depend on people recognizing that we are all in the same boat together. But I think we have to find ways of linking up with the intuitions that people already have. I mean, I don't know, I think of young people I know, for instance, some of my son's friends. They don't like to think about the political or social world at all. It's all, they think of it as just shit. You know, it's all just awful stuff. And all you can do is have a few friends who don't get involved in all this nasty competitive stuff. They have no criticism of it, they just have an intuition about it. And we must find ways of linking up with that. And making sense of people's intuitions in terms of a larger analysis of society and what's going on. That is not really an answer to your question, but maybe you could help.
Varsågod, ordet är ditt och gärna att du presenterar dig. Varsågod.
Hello, my name is Dennis Nyström. I'm probably going question that you have heard 30 times. The same evolutionary psychology arguments that you use to explain the statistics can also be used to explain why there should be inequality and gender inequality in society. What do you think about that, or can you elaborate on the subject?
Yes, and what's happened through evolutionary psychology, it started off as sociobiology, which belonged to the right, and it said basically that society was an expression of human nature and couldn't be changed, this was the way it should be. And we left it to the right. But actually evolutionary psychology has just as much to offer the left, and the battles of interpretation and theory and so on, and empirical observation to be made throughout the field. I don't think actually in terms of, in my view, is that the social predispositions like that bicycling reaction, the kicking down, or some of the things that come out in terms of social hierarchy, I think they are pre-human in their evolutionary origins. And that I think the evidence is very good that prehistoric societies, over 90% of our time as anatomically modern human beings, we have been remarkably egalitarian. Inequality comes in with agriculture. And inequality is actually about scarcity. It's only important to fight over access to essential goods and so on if there is scarcity. And you can see that actually in animals. Hierarchies get worse if there are droughts and so on, which Robert Sapolsky's work on baboons gives some nice examples of that. But under agriculture, there's now evidence that actually at the beginnings of agriculture and throughout most of the pre-industrial agricultural development, humans were actually shorter and poorer. Because you see, in a hunting and gathering society, those societies often recognize 100 different plants and animals as edible. And they only eat half a dozen of them. They don't bother with the others. So there are actually enormous reserves in the environment. But when you get to agriculture, people start by growing what amounts to grass seed to eat. And I saw a paper recently that said modern Greeks have only just reached the level of height of the prehistoric ancestors. Absolutely extraordinary patterns like that. But you see, under agriculture, there may always be bad harvests, where you only get a quarter of what you expect. So do I each year grow 3 times as much as I should need? Or do I only grow 30% more than I? So agriculture always has occasional scarcities and famines. But hunting and gathering societies, I think, often didn't have that. And there's some anthropologists who call hunting and gathering societies the original affluent societies, because the evidence suggests they could earn their living with very few hours work each day. But they depended on very sparse population numbers. As soon as densities build up, you have to use the environment more intensively.
Varsågod.
Yes, hello. My name is Elias. You said earlier in the presentation, we as people might be each other's rivals and friends and support and such. And I was wondering, as the human population increases, so does the number of people interfering and judging and helping you, support you in your ways of life. So my question is, I wonder if societies with high intensity of people suffer from high degrees of inequality.
Japan is one of the most densely populated. Their towns are dense. They have very small living units, and yet they're the more equal end. Even you could think of theories working either way around. And also in terms of population size, in our data, the USA is the biggest country. Japan is the next biggest at opposite ends. If you weight our correlations for population size, the relationships get even closer. We don't weight for population size, but that's the effect.
Tack, och jag ser på... Är det ytterligare någon fråga? Varsågod. Ganska kort, tiden börjar ta slut.
Does something like the Conservative Party in the UK's initiative, The Big Society, seem a very cynical move? Or is it something that you think is actually a vindication of the sort of policies that you've been talking about in action?
I believe that the idea of what the Conservatives, Cameron, are calling the big society, came out without any sort of real planning, and I believe that a speechwriter or someone thought of it quite quickly. And of course you can't do it at a time when there's likely to be rising inequality because of higher unemployment. The long-term unemployment, even if it's people at the top who become unemployed, it moves down and it's the bottom who become the long-term unemployed. But also the cuts in money to charities, because many charities depend on local authority, local government grants. All that is being cut and charities are protesting very vigorously. I think it's, even if it wasn't intended cynically, I think that it's completely threadbare concept. It might be possible to do it in a world with rising equality, but that would have to be the foundation of it.
Ja, det börjar bli dags att sammanfatta den här intressanta förmiddagen. Och jag tror att man kan sammanfatta vad vi har lärt oss, vad vi har diskuterat på de meningarna av var och en efter förmåga och till var och en efter behov. De meningarna är och har varit viktiga i arbetarrörelsens uppbyggnad av välfärdssamhälle i vissa delar av Europa. Jag tycker att det är viktigt att vi tänker på de meningarna i framtiden. Jag har blivit än mer övertygad naturligtvis genom dagens diskussioner. Och jag vill tacka dig, Richard Wilkinson, dels för ditt deltagande här idag som har betytt oerhört mycket, och naturligtvis för ditt engagerade forskningsarbete, för dina skrifter, dina böcker, artiklar och så vidare, som är så oerhört viktiga för oss i vårt politiska arbete. Så varmt tack! Jag vill tacka kollegan Katika Leopard som har deltagit här idag. Och jag vill naturligtvis tacka er som har deltagit. Jag tycker det har varit intressanta frågeställningar från er som har ytterligare vidgat diskussionen. Jag vill också tacka GUE-tjänstemännen som har arbetat för att arrangera det här. Vänsterpartiets delegation här i Bryssel. Och jag vill tacka GUE-NGS infoavdelning med Battistini i spetsen som har informerat om det här i parlamentet. Och jag vill tacka våra tolkar som har hjälpt oss att vi har förstått varandra även på de olika språk vi har talat. Varmt tack till alla, och nu vill jag också hälsa er alla välkomna till en cocktail som serveras direkt nu här utanför. Varsågod.
Can I just say one other thing, perhaps inappropriate, but The Equality Trust is tiny. It has money for 2 or 3 people temporarily. We are absolutely rushed off our feet. We've done 500 lectures in under 2 years. We have to spend all our time booking train fares and reclaiming expenses and so on. We're desperate for money and don't even have time to do the applications. So if anyone knows some rich people who'd like to give a donation, there's a donation site on our website, and please talk to us.
2, 3, du kanske borde hänga med dig mer i första klass Saint-Tropez. Sen kommer verkligheten fatta mer.